Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. It's over, we think. Both chambers of the legislature adjourned sine die yesterday. Before we get started, let's just hear some clips of how the presiding officers ended it all. We'll start with the House.
We started this session as a House in a bit of uncertainty, and I believe that we ended in a much more unified and solid place. And it took each of you from all spectrums working together, getting to know each other to a place that I am very proud of where we landed. I am proud of the work that we accomplished this session. I'm most proud of what we did for public education. I think it's transformative, and it was something we can all be proud of. I'm proud of our families who stayed home or helped while we were gone in our absence on these long days. Each of you worked hard, long hours, and I believe we have made Texas a much better place because of our work.
Okay, so there's a little bit more, but that was the
tone.
Yeah, most of what he said. I mean, after that, the speaker basically just kind of thanked everybody. Okay, now let's hear how Lieutenant Governor Patrick said goodbye to the Senate, or this Senate.
Members, before we close, at the end of every session, it's like you always hear a football team say to the coach in the locker room, when you come back the next season, there will be different guys on the team or girls on the team. And there will be different senators when we come back. We already know some are running for higher office, and they're up and out, as we call it. We know some people are thinking about their career choices. We know their retirement choices. So it's been a real privilege and honor to serve with all 31 of you. I wish you were all coming back, because we were a well-oiled machine, but I wish all of you the best in whatever your endeavors are coming ahead. We are a family, we say that. We really saw it today. We've seen it a number of times. You're my family, and so we'll miss you all. It's an odd world we live in. We come together for 5 or 6 months, depending on special sessions or not. We had a few years ago. We come together every year and a half, and it's like we're at summer camp together. It's best buddies, and we all want to help each other, even across party lines if we can do it. And we come to work for the people. Then we all go our 31 ways, and some of you never see each other for another year and a half or very little, and then we all come back together. So now the second part of the job you get elected for is to go home and serve your district and meet with your district and tell them all the great things we have done. I believe this is, in modern times, I can't go back 100 years, this is the finest session any Texas Senate has ever had. And I don't think we've ever had a better group of 31 senators.
So ending on a note, in both chambers of being very bullish on their members, which makes a certain amount of sense. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics, whose introduction got bumped by what was sort of a cold open.
Well, I'm okay to be bumped by the speaker and the lieutenant governor. It's all right.
Yeah, that seems...
It's fair. Fair and valid.
I think that shows how well adjusted you are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the 89 Texas Legislature is now in the books. How will it be remembered? We'll unpack some things today as they stand right now. And again, we're recording on the day after sine die, with the caveat, of course, there are lots of bills on Governor Greg Abbott's desk awaiting his signature or veto. Before we get into what we usually do, and I should say we'll be approaching this discussion with politics in mind more than the finer points of policy. It's too much policy to summarize anyway, and there are a lot of great summaries out there that a lot of the best reporters around in Texas politics have put together. I expect that you all can find those. We'll inevitably touch on a little bit of policy here and there, but we're going to talk more about the policies, and we'll start with we'll do a survey of how the priorities set by the legislature fared, public opinion, et cetera. Before we do that, Josh, I'm just curious, any comments on the Easter eggs and the subtext of the way that the leadership ended it?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think it was, I like the way that I'll just, my hot take reaction, would be say, it's interesting, or just interesting. There's nothing else to it. The way that Burrows, I think, pretty directly alluded to the trajectory. And we talked about this last week about the fact that, Burrows obviously entered the speakership under something of a shroud and some amount of controversy. He probably goes into the next session odds-on favorite to be elected with all of, nearly all or all of the Republican caucus, probably a good number of Democrats, most likely barring some major changes. And I think, he alluded to that very, again, in a very sort of moderate way, I think it's interesting on the flip side here, Patrick referred, I think himself is the coach of the football team. I think. Also,
holy sports metaphor, Batman.
Well, it was like, the sports metaphor, then we're a family, then it's summer camp. And I was like, well, that's great. So it's a team, it's a family, and it's a bunch of friends all at once. So, Campers, sounds great. I don't know if that really reflects certainly the last few weeks that I've watched. The well-oiled machine thing is interesting. I mean, obviously, that sort of speaks to a lot of the.
I guess that makes Molly Cook the bad daughter.
Yeah, that's right. That's well, everybody.
But she's still family.
She still gets invited to all the holidays. They still want her there. Black sheep or not, right? Everybody. Look, everybody's got an alcoholic uncle.
And again, we're not picking on Molly Cook.
No.
Just for those of you that watch the legislature, that they're, and we'll probably come around to this. There was, a very, very hot moment, towards the end of this session over the weekend involving Molly Cook and Mays Middleton that kind of seemed to sort of trigger the lieutenant governor in some ways, and we'll come around to that. But that's just a flag right off. We're not just picking on Molly Cook. It's a little too insidery a reference maybe.
Yeah, I guess we'll come back. I just think on this, I'll just say, the well-oiled machine reference is an interesting reference given sort of, again, what's gone on over the last, half dozen or more years in terms of the way that the Senate is run and the way it's operated and the way the lieutenant governor has really put his stamp on the way that it's run and operated. And it is sort of, I'm sure again, it'd be interesting to see what the members' faces looked like while he was giving this speech. I'm sure there were some who were nodding along, and I'm sure there were some who were just gritting their teeth.
Yeah, right. That's what's always interesting about watching these speeches and, hoping for some reaction shots and stuff. I mean, there were at least the folks that I could see in watching the Patrick final, speech was of the session. There were a lot of kind of stone faces that I could see. Good poker faces.
Yeah, they're professionals.
Wouldn't want to necessarily play cards with these people. I'd be careful. But I think it's hard not to. I mean, the well-oiled machine line really, really struck me for lots of different reasons, some of which are childish, but some of which, are very interesting. It's like it's a good time to go to a mechanical metaphor rather than one that involves, having yoked the Senate to his wagon. So,
right.
And having seen, as we said, the end, in the end, a very rare instance of what I would say the lieutenant governor showing a little bit of stress and a little bit of strain. And we'll come back to that at the very end as we do some assessment. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was good to start with those, because it also gives you, it invites you as you're to me, when you're evaluating what are these ceremonial kind of blowing of kisses at the end where there's, you can count on simply a lot of relief, even if there's ill will that's lingering. There were these little elements, I think a lot of which you caught. I mean, I thought that the way that Speaker Burrows kind of referred, and I thought a pretty lean, effective way to the arc of the session.
Look at where we've come. Look at where we are now.
Yeah, well, and you can't, you're talking to the body and you're referring to the body, but you're also, it's inevitably self-referential, at least a little bit, and I don't mean that in a mean way, but just, the fact that, look, here's a guy that came in, elected by a minority of the caucus. We were expecting, I think, a lot more conflict than we actually saw. And we talked about this a bit last week in terms of, even though people are kind of beating on him, or, a couple of people are beating on him for it, the way that they positioned and, just bit the bullet, moved the ESA bill, as soon as they reasonably could. And look, when that got moved, that ended with Donald Trump endorsing Burrows for re-election to office and to speaker. And,
Well, and I mean, and this is the opposite of scientific or measured or anything. But I think that once that ESA bill passed, and especially once the Senate just said, great, put thumbs up and moved it on, I mean, I think you could feel a certain amount of the pressure that's just been building for now years release.
Right. And we kind of talked about this last week. We don't have to rehash the whole thing. I mean, turned out Burrows, I think, was fortunate in who emerged as his most vocal opponents.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so let's talk a little bit about what we, kind of how this came out in terms of the output, kind of a quick survey of the major priorities and the minor priorities and how everything fared. So more or less, if we look at the big things that we've been talking about since last November, since the day after the election, really.
Yeah.
They delivered and in decent form. And, again, with the caveat that depending on what side of this you were on, they delivered an ESA bill with, to my mind, more money in the initial down payment than I think we were expecting, was widely expected.
Yeah.
I mean,
I was going to say
a number with a B in front of it is pretty, it's pretty big.
It's noticeable.
Yeah.
Sounds better than 900.
With minimal thrashing over that, really. Little more thrashing over property tax cuts.
I was actually going to say on the ESAs, in addition to the number, I was going to say I was a little bit more surprised at how open it was.
Yeah, how broad it was.
How broad
inclusive.
It was. Yeah, exactly. Anyway,
yeah, no, and I think you could, I guess that's, I don't know who that's a win for exactly, but above all, it's a win for Governor Abbott, right?
Yeah, I think, and I would say it's a win for Patrick too.
Yeah.
I mean, Patrick's been trying to get this done for
I mean, in terms of the openness of it.
Oh, yeah,
the universality, but I think the original Senate bill was more universal.
Yeah, the original Senate bill was I think was very wide open.
As I remember.
Yeah, and I think, I'd say this, for Patrick, I mean, ultimately, the more ESA, the more whatever it was was going is a win for him. I mean, ultimately he was trying to get anything across the finish line, it seemed, at this point. And so the fact that it was as expansive as it was, as inclusive as it is, even though that was what the governor was pushing, I'm sure, it's a pretty big win.
Right. And now, the implementation, watching the implementation of that phase through the controller's office will be very interesting, given the flux around we don't know who the next controller is going to be.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of interesting subterranean politics around that right now that we probably won't get into today.
And I think putting a pin in the whole notion of, what does oversight of ESAs look like going forward is going to be an interesting sort of political question.
I mean, there are a lot of decisions that vendors have to be chosen, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there's a lot.
As I started to say, they got the property tax cuts, again, with some debate over what that was going to look like, and I would say that Dan Patrick probably got more of what he wanted in that too than the House did. Yeah. But everybody wanted, and again, that was about the policy particulars.
Yeah, I think Patrick benefits there because I think his position on that is probably more closely aligned with individual senators' positions on that, and I think that probably helped. I mean,
in his caucus.
Yeah, in his caucus. Yeah, that's what I mean.
I think that's probably right. The thing with the biggest asterisk on it, although we just heard Speaker Burrows leaning hard on this, was public ed funding.
Yeah.
And that was another thing that I would flag in the Speaker's comments, that he went out of his way to clearly and explicitly say that he thought that the public ed funding was the most important thing they did.
I think he said public ed generally. And I think that's one of the interesting things. If you're going around and looking at some of the roundups and stuff, I mean, one of the things, there are specific articles that make reference to this, but also a lot of them kind of implicitly do, man, this was a pretty full public ed agenda this session, and we've had public ed agendas that have felt pretty full the last couple of sessions. Once you go through we divided these up a little bit different based on priorities, but once you go through all the ed stuff, it's actually pretty expansive. And if you look at again the $8.5 billion that they put towards public ed funding, that gets divided up into a lot of little different buckets.
Right.
Not a lot of different buckets, but different buckets that I think a lot of different constituencies can be happy with. They can say, the way that we did teacher pay was good. They can say, hey, we also dealt with librarians. We did all these things. Hey, we increased the basic allotment. And yet we can say, it should have been this much based on inflation, but nonetheless, it's the first increase since 2019.
Right, and I don't want to dismiss the opponents too much here. I mean, you're dismissing them.
No,
but
I'm not dismissing them.
It's fair to say, that there's still a lot of complaint that it was not enough money, and that's obviously in the context of the money that is now being discussed for ESAs.
My problem is that now the session's over, I'm already turning to elections, and I'm like, yeah, but they can say, and honestly, there are going to be Democrats who are going to say, hey, you know how much money we put into public ed?
Yeah, no,
so
everybody.
That's, again, even though there's definitely debate about whether it was the right amount or not, again, we're not trying to get the policy, the politics of it, pretty good for most people.
As you switch from trying to deal with stakeholder and organized interest group constituencies to the general electorate, you wind up having to, shall we say, adjust your message.
Right.
Right. They did the big water bill.
Yeah, and the way that ended up turning out was something, right? The $1 billion a year for 20 years.
It's I think again, you talk to some of the water, the water people will have objections. There were debates over the balance of that between maintenance, repair, retrofitting, and new projects. But all of that, you can't say that they didn't take it seriously, and you can't say that they have not committed resources. Will those resources maintain over that long period? What will that take? We'll see. So they did the water bill. Bail. Now, bail is an interesting one. Bail is another asterisk where, they did pass some tightening of access to bail for violent criminals.
Well, they put it to the voters, right?
Right. Yeah, it'll go to the voters, but
most likely that's gonna pass.
But they can say that they did it.
Yeah, and they can also point out to the fact when the voters go to vote for it again that they did it. It's kind of a nice thing. That's one thing about these sorts of constitutional amendment elections. It's like, especially something that's kind of most likely overwhelmingly popular. Then you get to point out again, hey, by the way, in November, guess what we did?
We're checking with you, but we still did this.
Right.
Right. And then we go down to just more or less the next tier. These are things that maybe one or two of them really.
We just jumped out of that real quick. And the point is, they didn't do everything they wanted to do on bail, and that's where the asterisk
and
comes in.
And there is a certain, there was some trepidation up until the very last minute that because they didn't do the most severe, ending of bail for a list of offenses that the governor might call them back. That is looking less likely, but I'm not here to predict the future, but the probability is we're not seeing the kind of messages from the governor that suggest that he's going to bring
Given
them
what
back
they
with
got
that.
done, it's not necessary to do it to take the political win at this point.
Right. I think they probably produced the minimum viable product.
Yeah, that's right.
In the context of all the other things they did do. Because if you call him back now as the governor, I think there's the calculation that says, am I taking the shine off of the things they did do?
Right.
If I really, and going into an election cycle, I'd be pretty surprised if you brought him back.
Yeah.
I think, not to take the most obvious position.
Sorry to go back. I just want to make sure we cover the asterisk.
So, other things, immigration enforcement is, it's been a very interesting session on immigration and the border, and we'll swing around to that when we talk a little bit more about the budget and that. But, we did get the bill that was, on people's priority list that requires, a chunk of local law enforcement to cooperate with ICE and to sign these agreements, these 287G agreements. And we were talking beforehand, you had seen some work on that. Those are kind of out there.
Yeah, really interesting the way that, that sort of is just, it's one of those things, again, in Florida, they've got 100% coverage on these. In Texas, about 14%. Most states, much, much less. But Texas is about to jump Florida in terms of having, we're going to be leading the country in terms of the number of agreements that exist once this bill is enforced.
I shouldn't even mention it, but I did notice in at least one of the earlier versions of that bill, but I think it's the version that passed, there's also funding for grants.
For small.
But only within, the range of,
It's for smaller departments.
Not for the big cities,
right.
Basically.
Yes.
Which, is another thumb in the eye of, the major urban areas, which is, they have scars where the thumb goes in and out of their eye. It happens so often now. Grid reliability, they did some work. Interesting, they empowered ERCOT to have more latitude for shutoffs of
big users, right?
Big industrial corporate, users, and by industrial we mean data centers, et cetera, which was an interesting way to do that to address that problem. Because we went in, there was a lot of discussion about how, certainly end of last year, early part of the session, and really going back for a while now, lots and lots of projections and discussion about just how much power, these two conjoined things were going to require in Texas. One, the relocation of more of these tech firms that have been attracted to Texas, but also just the increased energy needs of AI and data mining, Bitcoin mining and all of this. So an interesting thing, and they passed a few other bills kind of around the edges, So they were working on grid reliability, but I think this is the first session since the blackout.
Yeah.
Since Winter Storm Uri, that this hasn't been like something that people were watching in a very public way. Last session, all of the hearings on this were very crowded. They were very high visibility. Temperatures ran high.
Yeah.
The kind of inter and intrasectoral conflict was very public in a way that felt a little muted. Now, for those of you in that sector, I know that's not
They're like,
almost certainly not how it felt to you, probably, at least in terms of the tension around it. But it was just a little less.
Yeah, and you pointed to the ERCOT empowerment there, and it is really interesting. And I think if you look at it that longer term, and again, there's a bunch of other stuff that went on here, but it strikes me that, last session, part of the attention was partially because it was sort of trying to take a big bite at that apple, and it's very complicated. The other thing was there's a bunch of money floating around to sort of increase reliability last time. So obviously that's going to draw a lot of participants. What I think is interesting thinking about empowering ERCOT in this space is the fact that so they did all that stuff last time. And then I think, at some point there was, some, sort of shut off in some areas. And it was like, oh, so how much money did these entities make when there's grid strain?
Right.
And that was sort of part of the political discussion that was kind of interesting. And I think that's where I sort of put this in that area in my brain because it's like, oh, that's a political liability. You're giving, all these sort of subsidies to these industrial actors to essentially be ready. And then the power goes off and they make a bunch of money. It's like, well, wait a minute. But here now it's sort of like this is the other shoe to that, which is to say, okay, but now we also want to have the ability as the state to turn you off when we need to.
Yeah, and in the medium term, on the face of it, you can go, sensible.
Yeah.
But in political terms, an interesting way of rehabilitating ERCOT just enough to push some responsibility back on them.
Fun.
So if they screw it up, you can kick them again.
Well, we'll save this for later, but if we need to look for another model, we could look to Europe for how they manage energy.
So then, to kind of, before we lots of discussion this session about kind of religion in schools, probably most prominently and likely headed to the Supreme Court, the approval of the Ten Commandments bill, prayer time in schools.
And just to be clear for those of you who haven't followed this stuff too closely, a lot of this is about, essentially empowering local school boards. And there's some more of that goes on here. So just so you know, if you got kids in school, it's not like they're going to go to school, whatever, next Tuesday come August or something, and all of a sudden it's going to be prayer time. It kind of depends on where you live, a lot of stuff. So this still has some implementation.
Although the Ten Commandment thing was going to be a little more.
That's going to be a little bit more tricky because
that's going to be a little more universal, I suspect. Although even that is not a.
Well, the thing is, it's about. It doesn't require the districts to buy the Ten Commandments,
right? But if somebody provides them, they have to.
But this is actually where this whole thing kind of plays out, which is in places like Houston, Austin, with a lot of schools, San Antonio, with tons and tons of schools, and in turn, tons and tons and tons of classrooms. You can see this getting implemented more in smaller areas, smaller schools maybe at first, which obviously communities that might be more inclined, but we'll see how it plays out.
Right.
But you're right, courts most likely is how it's playing out first.
And then, also in the school realm, but also school religious values, air quote, the library material removal mechanism also works for school. One of those things that fits into your school board bucket.
Right.
The DEI and K through 12 ban was passed. I think probably what caused the most debate, friction, emotion on the floor of the House in particular, but also in the Senate, the idea here that you can't have
it's a ban on
school groups or clubs that are officially sanctioned that are about gender identity
or sexuality.
Right. So
those were interesting debates.
They were interesting, and there was a lot of I would argue that there was some obfuscation there. I think was very frustrating to a lot of people, and I think frankly fairly. That said, also the foreign land ownership restrictions, which got pared down a bit, but also a pretty emotional debate, but also, something that was going to get out in all likelihood.
Yeah.
The bill establishing a state definitions of gender. This is where, this big blow up on the Senate happened over the weekend in the debate between Mays Middleton, the author of that bill, and Molly Cook, which then triggered a reaction from the lieutenant governor. Something we probably, it wasn't on people's priority list, but I always feel like that we should have talked about this a little bit higher. The clarification of the abortion provisions.
Right.
This was clarifying what was left unclear or arguably unclear after the big abortion.
This was like a secret priority. It's like it's one of those things, I don't think you had a bunch of. I mean, you certainly. Actually,
that's a good kind of a You
didn't have a bunch of Republicans in positions of power and import on this question running around saying, what we really got to do here. But I think, from a political standpoint, from a public opinion standpoint, the longer that the legislature and state leaders let the lack of clarity around when a legal abortion can occur.
When a woman's health is in danger.
When a woman's health is in danger specifically is just if it's not already an albatross, it's going to become an albatross at some election as there's more and more information, again, essentially about, women dying while awaiting care that's not being given because of the lack of clarity.
Right.
So while this wasn't like something I'll say this, you're not going to see a ton of Republicans going out campaigning on this clarification, although I actually think there will be some. And we point out, and I think in another podcast, that when we asked about support for clarifying these laws, it was overwhelming.
And it was pretty bipartisan.
No, it was extremely bipartisan.
Yeah.
It was actually higher among Republicans than among Democrats. But it was the same. It was like 76, 75.
Yeah, right.
Long and short of it is this was something that kind of needed to get done. And it's something, if there's any other issue, this would almost be legislative cleanup if it didn't involve this issue and the nature of life and death of it. But because of what it is, I think it's like it was a secret. They had to deal with this in some way.
Right. And so we also did, there was also, there was a lot of activity around housing, and some of it didn't pass and some of it did.
Yeah.
And it was in many cases, not in most cases, it triggered two kind of different streams of thinking that are kind of out there in the wider body politic, right? I should say really maybe three. One is the just housing affordability.
Right.
We know that, from, the last couple of years of polling that when you ask people about economic concerns, et cetera, in Texas and also nationally, housing affordability ranks, the price of housing and housing costs ranks very high.
It's actually a really good thing in Access. I think this morning talking about the fact that right now there's about 500,000 more houses being offered for sale than there are buyers. And normally you'd expect prices to go down, but they're not because everybody's still hanging on to that.
Right.
But also you add the interest rates to that and you say, all these houses are unaffordable, and that's why you've got this huge gap right now.
Right.
And so a lot of the bills are trying to address that.
So there's that. There's the housing affordability piece. There's the kind of NIMBY urban development discussion that's going on there that is kind of disrupting what have traditionally, kind of traditional party lines on this. And this has been going on for a while. So there's that discussion that's going on. And then there's the state versus local authority and rulemaking ability discussion. So a lot really converged in this housing discussion at various moments. And, I think the most prominent thing they did sort of pass more a reduction in the minimum lot size requirements, most of which is traditionally, or all of which really has traditionally been done at the local level. The state set some minimums on that. So, an interesting area where there was a lot of work. Some things didn't get done, but this kind of thing I kind of expect to keep going on.
Yeah,
right?
It's really
kind of opened it up in a way that this has not been traditionally, a big area of legislative activity because of the local orientation of most of the rules. And it's kind of built because of all these these kind of, really all three of these things I'm talking about kind of converging.
Yeah, I mean, they touched on it last session. I mean, the interesting thing is you mentioned NIMBY. The alternative that people use is YIMBY, the Yes in My Neighborhood crowd. And it's interesting the way that, ideology, as you kind of move down from the federal level to the state level to the local level, it doesn't always translate perfectly. And on housing stuff in particular, it doesn't. The way that they did this, I think, to sort of, thread the needle through those three things you did was, one, they need to say they're doing something on housing.
Yeah.
They can't just point to property taxes because that doesn't do anything for, if you don't, the non-homeowners, right? To the extent that they can sort of roll back local regulations, mostly in the cities is where this applies.
Yeah.
Great. And I'd say for most, again, for people who want to see, more housing, they would also probably say great. This is one of these interesting sort of cross-ideological coalition things. But the other thing is the NIMBY pieces, but only on new builds.
Well, I was just going to say, we're being kind of thumbnail on this, but it was
that's
only in new development.
And that's what I was going to say.
Right.
And that's how you get the NIMBY piece of this is that, this is not about redeveloping the neighborhoods people already live in. This is about where the growth is happening. So the most part, for most of what I saw, in terms of the reduction in local rules, the minimum lot size is sort of the big one, because that's sort of the one that I think people who know anything about this issue kind of like say, oh, that's supposed to be really good. The other thing that they did was try to ease rules for developing housing along sort of major corridors and stuff, so in formerly commercial places, things like that, to again try to put more housing where generally people would like to live. And so that's the other piece of it.
Yeah, and then there were things that they didn't do in that space. I mean, in terms of, the conversion of commercial to residential and some of the other pieces of that. That's kind of why I think it's a really interesting. I mean, to be honest, it's a really interesting space, and it's going to continue because it's not an issue that's going away anytime soon. So you had the cell phone ban in schools,
but not a social media ban. I think we went ahead maybe.
Yeah, but which is interesting. The thing that we've got something on the list that is sort of something that happened instead of something else, kind of, and that's the lottery, right?
Yeah.
So, we talked on the podcast a few months ago. Lieutenant Governor Patrick, really went after the lottery when this notion of problems at the lottery and these kind of brokerages and all of this kind of came up. And that had the effect, I would argue, of, kind of also being, as I think I phrased it this way a couple of times on the podcast, where you say it again, kind of a bank shot against gambling, which, the expansion of gambling in various forms, none of which went everywhere. And I would argue really, to the extent that they had momentum, which I would argue is probably not much, but, a little bit, but any momentum that they were trying to build certainly just took a huge hit when the lottery became a big issue. And now, the Lottery Commission is being phased out. The lottery itself is being moved to, the Department of Licensing. So, stay tuned to that as well. There will be more. So the other thing, interesting here, and this is also, I will come back to this as a major theme, but also, there was a DOGE committee formed. Law was passed creating a DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, a state-level DOGE. A lot of activity on the DOGE committee, chaired by State Rep Capriglione in the House. I think one of the main outputs there was, was reinstituting remote work at state agencies, which is not the direction I thought we were going, but an interesting deployment, a little counterintuitive. But it's hard not to look at this at the end of the session and see, all kinds of, we did some DOGE stuff. Just the time that the DOGE thing seems to, like, a lot of the wind's coming out of the sails of that at the federal level. Where this was created. Now, I would say one might argue that they have accomplished what they've wanted in terms of the disruption and, the crippling of some of these state federal agencies. But nonetheless, I find that, an interesting, I will say this wryly, it's an interesting kind of area that will be interested to watch. Then there was this bill, guaranteed free speech on college campuses, set some state, sort of try to set some state rules for both protecting free speech, I think, to be, but also figuring out where the constraints were going to be and,
circumscribing while protecting.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Protection through clarification. I'm sure what they would say.
Well, and again, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of things, we'll kind of come back to this, but there's a lot of issues that have really, if you were talking about the same issue at the end of the last session versus right now,
Yeah.
you're not necessarily talking about the same thing. And in fact, you might be talking about like something different.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
free
that
speech is-
applies to a few of these things.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think, right?
So-
And then there's, this whole set of, things that didn't pass, right? Raising a lot of eyebrows, I think, just in the political community. There were big stories in both the Chronicle and the Tribune, I think. Texans for Lawsuit Reform had a pretty bad session. The one-time behemoth of the Republican Party now has a lot more competition. They would argue and have argued in those, their representatives did in those argues that they are, to some degree, victims of their own success, having kind of ruled the roost for a decade and a half and really carried out the tip of the spear on the anti-tort movement in the late 90s, certainly in the 2000s. They had two big bills, limiting damages. One was in particular was a trucking bill that they lost on. And there's stuff in social media. The spokespeople for TLR are, throwing some pretty big rocks right now at people over this. So, an interesting thing that people have noticed in the session. Another thing that didn't pass, the requirement for proof of citizenship to vote.
Right.
Now, something that the opponents of this said was really unnecessary since it was, already illegal for citizens to vote, but it was seen as a priority among, a certain faction of particularly the Republican caucus. That died.
I think it died under the own weight of the complexity of its implementation. I mean, if you start to read about all the issues they were having with trying to think about how that would actually, in practice, work, and I think it was like, maybe next session.
Well, and I think some of that, came out in the procedural problems that bill had once it hit the floor, particularly in the House. Something that we had pulled on and we knew was split Republicans, but was, largely pretty unpopular, was, various kinds of bans either on people's ability to travel to obtain an abortion where it was legal, or probably more consequently, I think, on the ground in Texas for most people, restrictions on the availability of, the abortion pill, medicated abortion.
And one thing, it's almost impossible to know, and I just admit this, from my seat, is, I don't know how much people's negative reaction to those two ideas was, I mean, I have some sense, but I don't know. I don't have a really firm sense of how much it was a negative reaction to the thing itself, like the travel ban, like banning assisting people in travel, banning assisting people in getting these pills. Because again, the person can get the abortion out of state; they can have the abortion and not be prosecuted. But it's about who's giving them these pills or who's helping them travel. And I don't know whether the negative reaction to that was to those specific things, or some combination, or alternatively, giving more individual Texans just the ability to sue people in a civil way to enforce these mechanisms.
Yeah, I think what the mixture of that is a little hard to tell.
It's a little
because we didn't, we've never done it in a way that we break it.
I know the travel stuff is unpopular because we've decoupled the travel stuff from the mechanism, and in particular, there's a liberty aspect here. Like people should be able to go to other states to do whatever they want. Yeah. So,
I mean, the other piece I would underline that too. I mean, we're talking about the opposition and. We kind of slid into the public opinion opposition, right?
Sorry.
The institutional opposition to these two is very, very interesting. I think we talked about this last week. It's a little bit, there was kind of an old school, like a moment on one of those, I think it was the more major restriction on access to abortion pills, where there were, people coming up to the back mic in the House going, hey, where's that bill? We know it was here, and then it kind of moved, and we can't find it.
Yeah.
Right. Which, some old school pre-digital legislative maneuvering going on there to slow the bills down, and also, and I think we talked about this last week. We won't go into it too much more, but just the idea that whatever the public thought, and or why the patterns in public opinion existed, there was some awareness of that. In the reluctance of the leadership, particularly in the House, to allow those bills to the floor and to force members to take a vote on them.
Well, and in that way, the session felt like a regular session.
Yeah.
Like a classic session.
I think we kind of ended in that
We'll probably
tone.
come back to maybe that in a minute.
Yeah.
I should add, just to be complete here,
Yeah.
they did pass a restriction on cities creating travel funds and distributing funds for that. So just to be clear, that was something that they did not like.
what's interesting is that's, look, if you believe in abortion rights, it's not good. But it's pretty small bore compared to, what was out there.
Yeah, and
right?
I think, and I'll just say, just in a broader wrapper, I think that speaks to what we've been talking about here a lot for a while, which is now that the car has been caught, now that the dynamics have changed around this issue, I think, public opinion is caught up a little bit. And it's not as though, this is still Texas. It's still largely, in the electorate, a conservative state, a Republican state for all, lots of reasons. And so it's not as though that, people are necessarily, say, a majority of the electorate is necessarily clamoring for big changes, but that's exactly the point. The majority of the electorate is not clamoring for big changes to these laws at this point.
Right.
And so it's very risky to start playing around in this area any more than you already have.
So you mentioned, banning minors from social media didn't pass. And that was really, we should probably, qualify that a little bit in that was requiring minors to not have access to social media without parental sign off or some
there are different versions.
There were a bunch of things floating on there, but they didn't.
I think that's part of the challenge.
Didn't take off, right? And then the other thing that was, I found pretty interesting was that the pretty highly publicized efforts to replace the STAR test with something else that was billed as eliminating it, but ultimately was kind of just jiggering the testing.
Right.
You know more about the testing because you have kids that have to deal with it, but it did sound like what they were doing was trying to reduce the impact of the test, the extent and the impact of the testing, rather than saying, no more testing,
Yeah, I think...
Which, is a reasonable policy position and from 10,000 feet.
Yeah, the gist, the really quick shorthand version of it is instead of taking a big sort of test of do you know all these things, the idea was more so to have 3 short tests and have the students essentially being compared against themselves. So did you grow? Are you growing? And the idea is to give just quicker feedback, all that. This is one of those things I think, you're right. This did get a little bit more attention. But to me, this is sort of something that probably, in addition to the fact that I think it's probably underbaked, and I think that's part of what we're talking about with a lot of these things that don't make it. You can see them come back. And I was saying, for example, the proof of citizenship to vote thing. If you read about that, the complexity of what if you're already someone who's registered to vote versus someone who's registering for the first time? How does this, what if you can't provide proof of citizenship? Well, then you can vote in federal elections, but not Texas. And it was sort of whoa, wait a minute. So what could happen here? It's just a lot of stuff. So it's look, is that idea going to come back? Probably, and they're probably going to think about a little bit more, streamline the approach, think about the implementation. I think same thing with the STAR test. It's this is a big deal, and it has a lot of tentacles. You're thinking about all these fights over, who's controlling the Houston school district, right? Harris County, or who is, again, essentially how is funding being determined? Who's, all these different things.
It feeds into how do we assess performance? All these other things are very, there's a lot of dependencies here.
So to bring this back up at a level is just say, this is one of those things had they started the session talking about this, and if this were the main public education priority that they were working on back in, February, March, this probably would have made it to the finish line.
Because there's a lot of critical mass. There's definitely a lot of negative sentiment about testing, particularly among
But you get to the end
parents.
of the session, and it does kind of become, and this was, again, a more traditional session, you're sort of okay, well, at least for me, I don't know how you do, but I'm sort of okay, I know what they've done from what they said they were going to do. I'm sort of got a running list, right? And then I've got the list of the other big things they said they were going to do, and you're kind of tracking where that is. And then there's this I wonder what's going to make it out of the rest.
Right.
And this was kind of in that rest group where you're there's only so much time left. What are they going to prioritize? And here's the thing. You have to prioritize it in both chambers. You got to, there has to be a critical mass to move these things along. And this is one of those things I think it was just not there yet,
Yeah, just, they ran out of gas.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Just okay.
Just ran out of gas.
No, let's do something easier that we all want to do.
So, we've kind of hit on the, a lot of the sort of media traffic, big discussion interest there. And we've been at it a while. So let's talk about a few of the things that were, maybe, surprising, the things that kind of, the way you just put that kind of provides a good transition. Things that kind of came up and that were, surprise, not like they came out of absolutely nowhere.
Right.
But that gained some prominence at times where, it's kind of going, wow, we're talking a lot about this, and that was not something that, we talked about the lottery and the gambling twist, and the lottery thing was clearly,
surprise.
That was not on people's list.
Not on their bingo card?
In, October, right? Can't talk about this, but talking about something that's always on people's radar, but took a funny turn this time, and that was the hemp pot thing.
Right, and that's probably the thing that's the most outstanding as we record this podcast.
Right, and so... a lot of discussion and a lot of theater, frankly, over the lieutenant governor's priority, and it was on the lieutenant governor's priority list, to limit or, to ban basically the availability of the hemp-based THC products that have gained by all accounts, multi-billion-dollar market in Texas, or business enterprise in Texas, that came out of the big hemp bill a while back. And, we said this, I think, we've said this already as this arose, but I mean, this is one of those, it's fair to say, hey, I don't think this is exactly what we were expecting when we did this for a lot of members. Now, I'm sure there were entrepreneurs out there that were like, all right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Clearly there were, because it's been spun up. But this was a really, interesting turn for the marijuana debate. And you were talking about this, the legalization of marijuana in the more conventional, your parents' pot.
Right.
This kind of came up in a way that just kind of derailed all of that discussion for the most part, with one important exception, and that is the medical marijuana exception. But even that kind of gained prominence in part as a result of all the prominence that was gained by the lieutenant governor's emphasis on this ban, and that he did not want to budge on.
Yeah, I think the constituency that I think Republicans are most concerned about with this bill is veterans, and I think that's where by prioritizing, or I say not prioritizing. Speaking to this, you said pie, and we're talking about hemp, and the thing that we obviously are thinking about is this, sort of removal of the industry. But you could also say even the expansion of the medical program, which was attached to this, was sort of not really something that I think, we're necessarily thinking was going to be a big priority this session. But
well, what I would say about that, I think is important, is that I would say all things being equal, which they aren't, but, holding a lot steady, the slow expansion of the list for people who qualified for access to medical marijuana was really kind of where the action has been.
Yeah.
And where, the controlled expansion has been coming. And look, if you look at our polling data, we've talked about it, it's pretty clear why that is.
Right.
Right? That's where you find the most
Republican support.
Most Republican support, and, bipartisan support, because most Democrats are like, well, yeah, sure, but, in addition, you should.
Yeah, or, I'm for legal marijuana.
Also,
why would I not give it
so
for
what do I
medical
care
purposes?
about? Make the list as long as you want,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I feel a little soreness.
Chronic.
And so that was where, that action kind of was in the, the hemp discussion.
Yeah.
The Delta 8 and Delta 10 and, all of this, and the products. And obviously, the governor had a press conference, or the lieutenant governor had a press conference on this that was, was pretty whack. Let's just, call it what it was. The lieutenant governor on,
Unhinged.
With about a week to go in the session, calls a press conference, or less than, I guess, and, says, come and there'll be snacks and drinks. And the snacks were this big display of hemp products, which somebody also pointed out. I wonder who went and bought those.
Right, is that state money?
Yeah, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
And at one point he
threw,
takes a bag of hemp snacks and chucks them at a reporter. Turns out, I think we found out it was Michael Atkinson from KI, who we both know and work with a bit.
It's good for me for my own little, just my own history. I love it.
Yeah, Michael's a big guy, seems kind of coordinated. I assume he caught it.
No, he didn't. He's very sad.
Oh, did he drop it?
No, he dropped it. He said he knew. I'm sorry if Michael's listening. Michael, I'm sorry. I have to relay this. He said he saw Patrick make eye contact with me. He thought, uh-oh, I better catch this.
That's good.
And then he didn't. So he's got to live that down. And now it's recorded for eternity.
I'm doing a hit with Michael after this. I'll make sure he knows that,
I outed him.
that you told him.
No, before that, I thought he was really sporty.
Yeah, no, it's very good. So, so that happens. And then at the end, he takes a question from Jeremy Wallace of the Houston Chronicle, which was, I think, not to insult Jerry, kind of a low-hanging fruit question. Yeah. Well, shouldn't adults just be able to decide what, I understand the thing about kids.
He mentioned alcohol and other
what
cigarettes,
about all these other, what about, what about liberty, sort of, and he called it a stupid question.
Yes.
Now, this was the morning after he had kind of the set to and made a procedural error on the floor.
Right.
that caused, gave the Democrat the opening to kill a few things, and
they did.
And generally was just one of those moments where something happens and the room gets very quiet.
Yeah.
When, the lieutenant governor had kind of a set to an exchange with Senator West, who kept his cool pretty steadily, I thought, by saying, we've never really done this. And those of you just go watch the video, but maybe we'll link it on the website. But, long story short, we were going to have to get to this. I guess this is where we do it.
Yeah.
There's an exchange over the bill we referred to earlier, the Middleton bill that, created a
gender definition,
very extensive definition of, the two sexes. And, implicitly sort of, as came out in the questioning, doesn't really make a distinction between sex and gender, but, not to be that guy. But
well, you are.
That person.
Here we are.
Sorry, not to be that person. And when Senator Johnson, Democrat, asked that exchange be reduced to writing, put in the record,
which is all the time,
very typical motion. The lieutenant governor wanted to put it to a vote.
I've never seen that happen.
Well, and people that have been watching a lot longer than both of us were like, I've never seen that happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so it was Senator West that kind of had made a parliamentary inquiry about why we're doing it now. And, ultimately after a little bit of, after expressing frustration that this had been taking a long time.
Really good at that exchange. For just history,
and he
that time of night.
Yeah. This was 12:40 a.m. The lieutenant governor said, "Well, it's first time for everything," which is a odd parliamentary explanation. We'll leave it at that. And then this press conference was the next day.
Then they actually did the vote.
Yeah. Then he actually relented, but I think he asked for objections and crickets,
like usual,
which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I thought someone might jump up and take the bait, but
or decide that they were going to stick up for the lieutenant governor and
that's what I mean by take the bait.
Favor.
Yeah, that's what I meant by take the bait. Is say I could be that guy or gal,
and nobody was.
Yeah,
a very interesting moment, and we'll come back to that. We probably won't have time now, but So the last thing on this kind of list of things came up that didn't seem all that prominent, but wound up gaining momentum was the cluster that we'll call kind of the Making America Healthy Again, MAHA, vaccines, healthy food,
exercise,
all of this, this cluster of bills. The one that kind of got the most debate on the House floor was Senate Bill 37, which I think that's right. Senate bill, yeah. Somebody will correct me, I'm sure, if that was wrong. That had a lot of labeling, additional labeling requirements for foods with additives, and the additive list, was where a lot of the lobby fights and the maneuvering to keep the bill viable went on. But that, they debated that bill on the floor for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah.
Towards the end. And I think if you look at now, Making America Healthy was on the lieutenant governor's list, top 40 bills. So it didn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
But I still think that if you were, again, looking at what was going on at the beginning of the session, or certainly at the end of last year, this was not very high on people's list. Now, obviously a national dynamic here. Twice in the floor debate, in the House on this bill, the bill sponsor, Lacey Holm, mentioned conversations first with the White House, and then, after, I think, as they were doing the final vote, or maybe when it came to third reading, she mentioned having had a conversation with RFK Jr. About the bill. So there's an interesting kind of national dynamic going on here. A lot of people are interested in you'll have to, maybe you know me well enough. For some reason, when people refer to this horseshoe thing about the left and the right, where there's a coalition of what are usually opposed forces on the left and the right.
Yeah.
It just kind of bugs me. I don't know.
It doesn't really make sense.
Well, if you think the metaphor makes sense, and at first it didn't, but
but aren't you meeting in the middle?
Well, that's what the horseshoe.
But that's not the point. You're not meeting in the middle. It's almost like it's almost like what you have to do is anyway. This is stupid.
Right. Well,
it's almost like you have to go outside the distribution.
Well, we're having different response.
Anyway.
To me, it wasn't the metaphor itself.
Okay.
It's the broader kind of
Well, it's not
You know,
right. It's
sometimes the extremes are kind of the same.
But see, that's
blah,
the
blah,
thing,
blah.
but that's not right. That's why it's not right in this case. I mean, it's one thing when the ideologies of the most extreme people lead them to the same conclusion. It's not the same conclusion per se. I mean, it's partially that's leading these two groups in. It's actually like almost an amalgamation of different things that people sort of agree to. I mean, I talked to a lot of, I'll just put it this way because I think it's fair. I talked to a lot of middle-aged female Democrats, during sort of the rise of RFK, and a lot of them would say something like, "Man, that guy's crazy," but also I kind of agree with him on these handful of things.
And that's what she talked about, like suburban moms and crunchy granola moms. It's the coalition of and there was not a ton of pushback from Democrats on this.
No.
I mean, they pushed back, but I think that was a lot more, there was a lot more interest group activity going on.
Well, and that's what's interesting because in all of this,
some Democrats pushed
because it's not really the domains of Democrats to push back on like corporate labeling of additives, like to push back on having kids exercise.
And so
more
that's
in
why,
school.
look, I mean, it's not unfair to note that this was an interesting coalition, right? And that there were some strange bedfellows, shall we say?
Yeah.
But anyway, so the point being, this took on a pretty big presence towards the end of the session, and that was some pretty valuable real estate, time-wise, in the final substantive weekend when that debate took place.
I'll say we're going to put a pin in this. We'll come back to some other time, but this whole thing is like is it either it's sort of like. Is it an isolated incident or is that sort of an example of something else? And I don't mean that like there's going to be a coalition that's going to emerge, sort of a left-right coalition. But in some ways, I mean, the only thing that makes this possible, like the idea, and by this, I'm just saying like real quick, like in a conservative state like Texas, the Republican-led legislature with Republican statewide leaders in every position just implemented one of the most far-reaching food labeling regimes in the country based on the European Union. And you're like,
there's something strange about this.
There's something strange about this. And part of it is just to say, and again, to me, I sort of think about it, sort of there's some truths that everybody's reacting to, but there's also the lack of constraints or the lack of some constraints for certain people that were just sort of taken for granted. I mean, to your point, it's like, so you're saying that the legislature didn't pass TLR's big priority, right, but they also passed this bill that's really turning the screws on food labelers, packagers, consumer packaged goods to be really upfront with consumers about what they put in their products. And you're like, okay, so how do we describe what that orientation is towards the business environment?
Well, and we're seeing that, to be fair, we're seeing this in other areas, like, the housing thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I mean, the housing thing plugs into this big debate going on the Democratic side. The Ezra Klein, I can't remember the other co-author's name, sorry. The abundance versus populism thing going on, in Democratic podcast circles now and policy circles. So, I think we have to end very quickly just saying, okay, public opinion wise, just to stay on brand.
Yeah, sure.
Where does this land? I mean, my broad feeling is if we look back at our open-ended question about legislative priorities, it lands in a pretty interesting way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm looking at it, reacting in real time. I mean, just a note real quick. So when we asked people, in April, so during the session's in full swing, I would say it's not, people can say whatever they want, but in some sense they maybe have been hearing the message about what they're focused on. Yeah. So we'll see how much alignment there is. At that point, the whole electorate, equal share is 15%. Right? They can only say, we only record one response. What is their top priority?
Right. And again, just to reiterate, we said it's an open-ended item.
Right. So that people can say whatever they want. Equal shares, 15% said they should focus on immigration, the border. 15% said the economy and prices. If you add up all of the public education-related responses, so people who said something about public education and those who said something either pro-ESA or anti-ESA, which means they were focused on education, that adds up to 14% of the electorate. So almost right there, about 15, 14, you're 45. You're almost at half the electorate right there on those three issues. And then you've got property taxes.
Wait, say that again. Why half the electorate?
15 for immigration, border security. Another 50 for the economy prices.
Okay,
and then another 14 for the.
I thought you were just adding up the education thing.
Yeah, so you're about 45.
Okay, gotcha.
Then you throw property taxes or taxes. A property taxes is 7%, 5% just mentioned taxes. That's 12%. So now you're over a majority of the electorate just on the property tax issue, education, immigration, border security, and anything that sort of moves the economy, keeps it humming.
Right.
Right. And after that, everything's obviously going to be a lot smaller. It's going to be a lot more random. Water supply was actually really high. It was the next highest at 4%. So again, good job.
And they did that.
And they did that. Among Republicans, because that's really, again, the majority party voters in the state, 26% said it should be focused on immigration and border security. Another 14% said the economy and prices. Property taxes, 12%. So again, real quick, if we look at that again, 30, 40, we're already at 52% of Republicans.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the way that we tend to think about this. And I'd say this, if these issues are important to a lot of Republicans, it's likely that even if they're not the top issue for other Republicans, they're still important issues. And so I think if you look at it that way, you'd say, they really kind of hit as I always say, the fat part of the distribution here.
Yeah. And, I guess what I totally agree with that, Reed. I guess as I'm looking at this now, one of the things, this really does also, though, echo a theme we've been wrestling with for the last few years, which is the two most common responses, immigration, border security, economy, prices, are both just inextricably intertwined with national politics and national policy. Mm-hmm. And there's only so much that the legislature can do in that space. Right. And I think one of the things we did see this session, the moments when Trump intervened or, started sending strong signals. He sent strong signals. He called the caucus the morning of the ESA vote, endorsed, as we said earlier, endorsed Dustin Burrows, and everybody voted for it. Yeah. With a, wave of his scepter, I guess, after they passed it. The economy and prices, we've been like a broken record in here about how fundamental there's only so much they could do on that. But that's where I think that things like the reduction in property taxes, becomes helpful to them.
100%.
Because they get to advertise that as related to that realm of people's concerns.
And as much as people want to talk about the fact that, it doesn't impact renters, but that's also the thing, home ownership correlates with voting. And midterm elections tend to be smaller electorates. Yeah. And so, if you're focusing, your big giveaways, if you want to call it that, on the people who are most likely to show up in midterms, well, good. Mission accomplished.
And then you've got this immigration and border security piece, and the terrain on that, has really changed in the last 18 months. I mean, we've talked about that. Mm-hmm. There's been while it's still very prominent as a Republican concern, and it was prominent going into the session. And if we look at the most important problem assessments facing the state, or most important problems facing the state assessments, the share of Republicans, it still dominates, but it's dropped dramatically.
Yeah.
Right. And it's pivoted to this much, I think, more difficult space on immigration enforcement rather than the border. And an interesting subtext of this, and this was flagged in the Tribune coverage of, their session wrap up, and so hats off to them. But, to follow through on something we talked about much earlier in the session.
Yeah.
So we've been saying all session.
Right.
Okay, they allocated $6.5 billion for border security. Mm-hmm. Obviously, keeping the funding steady from where it's been.
Right.
And obviously a galactic increase, not to beat that horse bloody again, from where we were, say, a decade ago.
Right.
But they also increased, kept that spending steady at a time that border crossings and, the traffic on the border, the issues at the border had really subsided.
And we're in negotiations for a big refund.
And we're trying to get refund money in this, problematic, but this budget discussion at the national level,
right,
in the Congress. Well, as it turns out, and we had wondered if they were going to hold that money in reserve, they were just going to see what happened with Trump. Did the border flare up again? Which makes all the sense in the world. Mm-hmm. So they waited, but then in conference, they cut that spending from border security. That item went from 6.5 to 3.35 billion. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll put a pin on this, and we'll just say we're going to pick this up next week and talk, or next time we do a podcast, we'll talk about this stuff more. Near as I can tell, looking at the previous budget bill and then the final version that was sent to the governor, they cut the spend, near as I can tell, about $2.6 billion of that reduction came from the trusted programs in the office of the governor. Something else had been me in particular, beating a dead horse on the strengthening of the governor's office and the way that the implementation of Operation Lone Star gave the governor a lot more resources and a lot more. Very interesting that that's where they pulled the money. And then another $500 million came from the Texas Military Department, also closely aligned with
Right.
the governor compared to DPS. The DPS funding didn't change. Most of the other brackets were held pretty easy. And again, to step back, $3.35 billion for border security in Texas is still high.
Yeah.
By historical standards,
Right.
even
That's
if,
right.
you account for inflation or whatever, right? And we've, again, talked about that a lot. But it was a very interesting last-minute change. Now, I find it hard to imagine that they would do that without the governor's office knowing this. But it will be interesting to see how this plays out. Remember, the lieutenant governor's going to go through this budget. He's going to have a line item veto.
The governor.
The governor is going to have a line item veto. It's a Freudian slip, if ever there was one. And, we're going to see how the governor responds to this budget, and if there's any commentary on this,
Well, I think
et cetera.
and that's the thing, I guess, in terms of like, what are we watching? It's like, well, let's see what, maybe in another podcast coming up, maybe we'll do a little bit of evaluation. It actually might be good to wait a week and see how everything plays out. But this is one of the things we're waiting is, okay, so what happens on that hemp bill? Because, I got to say, it's hard for me, if the governor was not fully aware of that cut, and I'm not saying they're related in any way because they're not, but if he's not fully aware of that cut, it really there's probably going to be some kind of consequence. I'm just kind of curious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, and I just find it
seems very hard to imagine.
Very hard that, this wasn't part of their strategy. And look, the timing of this is, it's fairly recently in some of the budget bills that have been produced in the U.S. Congress. It's a fairly recent kind of mid-session on our side development that the Congress is now talking about putting some of this money for compensating border states, and most of it would go to Texas,
right,
as we understand it. So, kind of watching that. And also, you're right. We shouldn't leave without saying, if there's one thing that people are really speculating about right now, more than anything, it's what is he going to do about that hemp bill?
Can I say one more thing about that?
Yeah.
I think the thing that sort of strikes me that's interesting, or where I would say, there's a lot of pressure on Abbott. And look, he could go either way on this, but I would say, and we've said this a bunch of times, nobody designed what is going on right now. And knowing what we know about politics, I think you certainly know more about this particular than I do. But man, if opening up a new industry isn't a possible opportunity, both for those who want to enter the industry, but also for legislators who want to benefit from crafting the rules of an industry. And everybody who listens to this knows a lot of what the legislature does is craft rules around industries about who gets to participate, who doesn't. It's big business. Yeah. And with this,
you pick winners and losers.
They pick winners and losers. And the thing is, the hemp bill created this whole market, and nobody, in terms of in the elected class, really got to benefit from it. So one of the things I just sort of look and say, there's a possibility that look, it's very easy that Abbott could say, hey, look, this is too far, too fast. We're not going to do it this time, but let's come back next time and do this the right way. There's also the possibility he says, yeah, let's do this. And then, maybe not when Patrick's still here. Maybe so. Let's have a talk about what this would look like if we were to actually implement it.
Right.
And then everybody gets to say, come tell me your best ideas.
If I had to bet, I think it's going to be pretty hard for him to not sign that bill. But, I don't know.
Yeah.
The context will be important here. Like, what else does he veto and not veto?
Right.
What, how do these things kind of play out? And but again, where we started this little subsection, pretty surprising.
Yeah.
Not something that I think was easy. Anybody was calling going into the session like, we're going to be talking about in early June whether Greg Abbott is going to sign or veto a bill that is basically outlining all these hemp products.
Yeah.
So,
and it's quaint and almost almost feels historical. It's like, it's not the only reason we're talking about. It's like, well, why is it so interesting? It's like, well, I don't know. The lieutenant governor went out and threw food at reporters and again, in the last 10 days of the session is calling this press conference to essentially, admonish everybody. And I think that the piece of that is, one, kind of weird. Two, it tells you that the signature is not guaranteed.
Right. Yeah. We should say, it's a good point to throw in there is that, the hemp throwing and all of that was part of it. And calling Jeremy Wallace's question stupid was, part of a general tone in that conference is like, the reason that people aren't on my side on this issue is because you all are not covering it correctly.
Right.
Also an interesting approach in the larger meta moment we're in terms of media. So with that, Josh, thanks for being here. we'll post some stuff on the website. If you're listening to this on one of the major platforms, if you go to our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, you'll find data. We'll put some of the clips, some of this video stuff, some other things on there. We'll put the data on there, and you'll find all the poll results we alluded to at our website with all the usual graphics that you can download and primary documents. So thanks again to our excellent production team here in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for listening if you made it this far, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.